March 14th, 2026, 2:47 a.m. A Russian ammunition depot near Starobilsk occupied Luhansk Oblast. 12 transport trucks, 43 personnel on the night shift, thousands of tons of artillery shells stacked in rows stretching across a facility the size of 16 football fields. By 3:15 a.m., every shell would be cooking off. Every truck would be burning. And the explosions would not stop for 8 hours. This is the story of how Ukrainian intelligence tracked, targeted, and obliterated the single most important ammunition hub feeding Russian artillery across the northern Donbass. A strike so devastating that Russian battery commanders were rationing shells for 3 weeks afterward. A strike that cracked open a window Ukraine's assault infantry kicked wide open. I'm your host at WarfistTV, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today, we're breaking down one of the most consequential deep strikes of the entire conflict. Not because of the fireball, though the fireball was spectacular, but because of what happened on the Kreminna front line in the days that followed. Real tactics, real consequences. WarfistTV. Let's start where this operation actually began. Not on the night of March 14th, weeks earlier. To understand the Starobilsk strike, you have to understand what Ukraine was facing along the Kreminna-Svatove axis. In February 2026, Russian forces had been grinding forward through the forested terrain west of Kreminna since the autumn of 2025. The advance was slow, measured in hundreds of meters per week, but it was relentless, and it was fueled by one thing above all else: artillery volume. Russian doctrine in this sector hadn't changed since the summer of 2024. Saturate Ukrainian positions with shell fire. Push infantry forward under the suppression umbrella. Repeat. Every day. Every night. An industrial approach to warfare that treated human lives and ammunition as interchangeable consumables. And the ammunition was flowing. Ukrainian military intelligence, the HUR, had been watching the logistics pattern since late 2025. Open-source analysts had flagged increased rail activity on the Milarovo-Starobilsk line as early as November. Commercial satellite passes showed new construction at a facility 12 kilometers southeast of Starobilsk, expanded revetments, fresh earthworks, a second access road cut through the tree line to accommodate heavy vehicle traffic. By December, the picture was clear. Russia had consolidated its ammunition distribution for the entire northern Luhansk and upper Donetsk front into a single massive hub. Railcars arrived from Russia carrying 152mm howitzer shells, 122mm Grad rockets, mortar rounds, rocket motor assemblies for Shahed one-way attack drones, and crated components for the Lancet loitering munitions that had become the bane of Ukrainian armor crews. The depot was not small. Ukrainian intelligence estimated the facility held between 4,000 and 6,000 tons of ordnance at any given time. Trucks departed every night, convoys of 5 to 8 vehicles heading south and southwest toward forward ammunition points along the Kreminna and Siversk axis. The resupply cycle was clockwork. Trucks arrived between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. They loaded at the distribution sheds. They departed before dawn to avoid daylight drone surveillance on the roads. Which weapon system posed the greatest threat to Russian logistics in this war? Was it A, HIMARS precision rockets, B, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, or C, ATACMS tactical ballistic missiles? Drop your answer in the comments below. The challenge for Ukraine was range. Starobilsk sits roughly 120 kilometers behind the nearest point on the line of contact. That distance placed it beyond the reach of HIMARS firing standard M31 guided rockets, which max out at approximately 84 kilometers. It was too far for most drone systems. And Storm Shadow cruise missiles, while capable of the range, were in limited supply and typically reserved for command and control targets or air defense nodes. But ATACMS was different. The MGM-140 ATACMS, Army Tactical Missile System, is a solid-fuel ballistic missile that launches from the same M142, HIMARS, or M270 MLRS platforms Ukraine was already operating. The Block 1, A variant, which the United States had been supplying in increasing numbers since late 2024, carries a 227-kilogram unitary warhead and flies at speeds exceeding Mach 3. Its range, up to 300 kilometers. At 120 kilometers, the Starobilsk depot was well within ATACMS reach, but range alone doesn't win strikes. Precision does, and precision requires intelligence. This is where the human network mattered as much as the satellite imagery. Ukrainian partisan networks operating inside occupied Luhansk Oblast had been providing ground-level reports since the early months of the occupation. These weren't soldiers. They were locals, railway workers who counted the cars, truck drivers who noted the license plates, residents who watched the convoys pass their windows at 2 a.m. and sent encrypted messages to handlers across the contact line. By late February 2026, HUR had assembled a targeting package that combined 3 independent intelligence streams. First, commercial and military satellite imagery showing the facility layout, identifying individual storage bunkers, staging areas, and vehicle parking zones. Second, partisan reports confirming the resupply schedule, the typical number of trucks present during the overnight loading window, and, critically, the location of a Shahed drone component storage section that had been added to the facility's western perimeter in January. Third, signals intelligence from intercepted Russian military communications that confirmed the depot's role as the primary distribution node for at least 4 brigade-level formations operating on the Kreminna-Svatove line. The targeting package went up the chain. Authorization for ATACMS employment required coordination between Ukrainian Armed Forces Command and the Pentagon, since the missiles were American-supplied and their use carried escalation implications. The approval process, which Ukraine had streamlined considerably since the first ATACMS strikes in late 2023, took approximately 72 hours. On March 12th, the strike was authorized. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 12 minutes of this breakdown shows you how a single salvo of missiles can reshape an entire front. The execution plan was straightforward in concept, but demanding in timing. Ukrainian planners selected a launch window during the overnight resupply cycle, specifically between 2:30 a.m. and 3 a.m., when the maximum number of transport vehicles would be parked inside the facility perimeter. This wasn't about just destroying the stored ammunition, it was about catching the trucks too. Every truck destroyed at Starobilsk was a truck that wouldn't be delivering shells to a Russian howitzer crew the next morning. 2 M142 HIMARS launchers were positioned at pre-surveyed firing points west of the Oskol River. The launchers had been moved into position after dark on the evening of March 13th, traveling along routes that Ukrainian electronic warfare teams had swept for Russian drone activity. Each launcher carried a single ATACMS missile. A third launcher, positioned as a backup 12 kilometers to the north, held 1 additional round in case of a misfire or a required restrike. The fire mission was synchronized with a broader deception operation. At 2:20 a.m. on March 14th, Ukrainian artillery units along the Kreminna line initiated a series of harassing fire missions. Standard 155mm rounds directed at known Russian positions. The purpose wasn't destruction. It was noise. Every Russian radar operator, every signals intelligence post, every air defense battery in the sector would register the incoming fire and orient toward the contact line, away from the deep rear. At 2:41 a.m., the HIMARS crews received the fire command. The launch sequence for an ATACMS missile takes less than 60 seconds from command receipt to missile away. The M142 platform's onboard fire control computer verifies the target coordinates, calculates the ballistic trajectory accounting for wind speed, temperature, and Earth rotation, then feeds the flight program into the missile's inertial navigation system. The crew doesn't aim the launcher manually. They confirm the firing solution and press a button. At 2:42 a.m., the first ATACMS lifted off from its launch pod on a pillar of white-hot exhaust. The solid rocket motor accelerated the missile to over Mach 3 within seconds. It climbed steeply into the night sky, arcing eastward on a ballistic trajectory that would carry it to an apogee of roughly 50 kilometers above the Ukrainian countryside. 14 seconds later, the second ATACMS launched from the adjacent platform. Both missiles were now in flight, timed to target at 120 kilometers, approximately 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Russian air defense coverage in the Starobilsk area was not negligible. Intelligence had identified at least one S-300 battery positioned to the northeast, along with a shorter-range Buk M2 system covering the approaches from the west. These systems were theoretically capable of intercepting a ballistic target. The S-300's 48N6 missile has a limited anti-ballistic capability, and the Buk was designed to engage tactical missiles. But ATACMS arrives fast, very fast. At terminal velocity, the missile is descending at roughly 1,500 meters per second. the radar acquisition window, the time between when a ground-based radar first detects the incoming missile and when it impacts is measured in seconds, not minutes. And those seconds were further compressed by the harassing fire that had Russian air defense operators focused on the wrong threat axis. At 2:44 a.m., the first ATACMS missile struck the central storage area of the Starobilsk depot. The 227-kilogram unitary warhead detonated on impact, sending a shockwave through the nearest row of ammunition bunkers. For a fraction of a second, there was a single explosion. Then, the secondaries began. The physics of a sympathetic detonation chain in a large ammunition storage facility are terrifying in their simplicity. The blast wave from the initial warhead impact cracks open adjacent storage containers. The overpressure ignites propellant charges. The heat detonates fuses. Each exploding shell generates its own blast wave, which reaches the next row of shells, and the process repeats, not in a controlled sequence, but in a cascading, accelerating chain reaction. The second ATACMS struck 11 seconds after the first, impacting the western section of the facility, the area where Ukrainian intelligence had located the Shahed drone component storage. The warhead detonated among crated rocket motors and guidance assemblies, igniting a secondary fire that burned at temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius. Within 60 seconds of first impact, the Starobilsk depot was producing its own explosions faster than any external weapon could have generated them. Individual detonations blurred into a continuous roar. Shells launched themselves sideways out of ruptured bunkers. Rocket motors ignited and streaked across the facility grounds like unguided projectiles. The 12 transport trucks that had been parked in the loading area, trucks that had arrived from 3 different brigade supply battalions, were shredded by shrapnel and consumed by the spreading fires. Drone operators from a Ukrainian reconnaissance unit positioned west of the contact line captured the first thermal footage at 2:51 a.m. The imagery showed a thermal signature so intense that it overwhelmed the drone's infrared sensor at maximum zoom. The entire facility was a single white mass on the screen. Individual detonations appeared as flares erupting from the central mass every few seconds. Subscribe to WarfistTV if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happened at Starobilsk wasn't just an explosion, it was a masterclass in targeting, timing, and understanding the enemy's vulnerabilities. Let me break down what the next 8 hours looked like. The initial detonation chain, the first wave of sympathetic explosions, lasted approximately 45 minutes. During this phase, the largest individual blasts occurred. Ukrainian seismic monitoring stations registered ground vibrations consistent with explosions equivalent to several tons of TNT, detectable at distances of up to 90 kilometers from the impact site. Residents in Starobilsk itself, 12 kilometers from the depot, reported windows shattering and walls cracking. The sky to the southeast glowed orange. By 3:30 a.m., Russian occupation authorities in Starobilsk had begun evacuating nearby settlements. This was significant. Russian military and occupation officials almost never acknowledged strikes on their own ammunition facilities. The evacuation order, which was documented by local social media posts before Russian censors could scrub them, was an implicit admission that the situation was beyond containment. Between 3:30 a.m. and 6 a.m., the explosions transitioned from a continuous roar to a rhythmic pattern. Heavy detonations every 30 to 90 seconds as individual bunkers cooked off. Satellite thermal imaging captured during an overhead pass at 5:14 a.m. showed a burn area already exceeding 8 hectares, with active fire fronts advancing into sections of the facility that had not been directly struck by the ATACMS warheads. The ammunition was destroying itself. How many tons of ammunition did Ukraine estimate were stored at the Starobilsk depot? A. 2,000 tons, B. 4,000 to 6,000 tons, C. 8,000 tons. The answer is coming at the end of this video. By sunrise on March 14th, the smoke column from Starobilsk was visible on commercial weather satellite imagery. It rose to an estimated altitude of 4,500 meters and drifted northeast across the occupied territory. The last significant detonation was recorded at 10:53 a.m., 8 hours and 9 minutes after the first ATACMS impact. Satellite imagery collected 24 hours after the strike revealed the full scope of the destruction. The facility's central storage area, roughly 3 hectares, was completely obliterated. Craters overlapped where individual bunkers had detonated. The revetment walls that had been constructed to contain blast effects had been breached in multiple locations. The western storage section, where the Shahed components had been housed, had burned to its foundations. Ukrainian intelligence assessed that the strike destroyed between 3,500 and 5,000 tons of ammunition, the full contents of the depot at the time of the strike, minus whatever small quantities had been loaded onto transport vehicles that may have departed before the missiles arrived. The 12 transport trucks inside the facility perimeter were confirmed destroyed. Satellite imagery identified their burned-out chassis scattered across the loading area. The total estimated value of the destroyed materiel, including the artillery shells, Grad rockets, mortar rounds, Shahed components, lancet assemblies, fuses, propellant charges, and the transport vehicles themselves, was assessed by Ukrainian military analysts at between $380 million and $520 million. 2 ATACMS missiles, each worth approximately $1.5 million. Total strike cost, $3 million. Return on investment, somewhere between 120 to 1 and 170 to 1. That ratio tells you everything about the asymmetric logic of precision deep strike warfare. You don't need to match your enemy shell for shell. You need to find where the shells are and make them all explode at once. Now, let's talk about what happened on the front line. Because the fireball at Starobilsk, as dramatic as it was, matters less than what it did to Russian combat operations over the following 3 weeks. The Starobilsk depot was not one of many distribution hubs serving the Kreminna-Svatove axis. It was the primary hub. Russian logistics planning had concentrated ammunition flow through this single node for reasons of efficiency. Rail access, road networks, and proximity to the multiple brigade areas of responsibility it served. Concentration made the logistics simpler. It also made them fragile. Within 48 hours of the strike, Ukrainian signals intelligence began intercepting Russian communications that revealed the scale of the disruption. Battery commanders in the 144th Motor Rifle Division, positioned along the Kreminna axis, reported to their battalion headquarters that their forward ammunition points had received no resupply since the morning of March 14th. Similar reports came from units in the 3rd Army Corps operating near Siversk and from elements of the 20th Combined Arms Army along the Svatove line. By March 17th, 3 days after the strike, intercepted communications painted a picture of acute shortage. One battery commander, identified by Ukrainian intelligence as serving with a howitzer battalion of the 144th Division, was recorded telling his superior that his unit had been rationed to 37 rounds per gun per day. His pre-strike allocation had been 110, 37 rounds, down from 110, a 66% reduction in firepower overnight. And it wasn't just his unit. Across the northern Luhansk front, Russian artillery output dropped measurably. Ukrainian frontline units reported a dramatic decrease in incoming fire starting on March 15th. Positions that had been receiving dozens of shells per hour were now taking sporadic fire. 5 or 6 rounds, then silence for extended periods. The relentless grinding pressure that had defined the Kreminna sector for months eased almost overnight. If you believe tactics win wars, type WarfistTV in the comments, because what Ukraine did next proves it. Ukrainian commanders recognize the window immediately. When your enemy's artillery goes quiet, you don't wait to see if it comes back. You move. On March 18th, 4 days after the Starobilsk strike, Ukrainian assault groups from the 12th Azov Brigade launched a series of coordinated attacks in the Kreminna forest sector. The operations targeted Russian defensive positions in the tree lines east of the Zherebets River, positions that had been held by Russian forces since October 2025 and had resisted multiple Ukrainian attempts to dislodge them. The previous attempts had failed primarily because of one factor: Russian artillery response. Every time Ukrainian infantry moved into the open ground between tree lines, Russian guns zeroed in. The kill zone was pre-registered. The suppressive fire was overwhelming, but now the guns were quiet. The first assault group, a reinforced platoon of roughly 40 soldiers, crossed the Zherebets at 4:30 a.m. on March 18th under drone overwatch. They moved through the frozen ground on the eastern bank and reached the Russian forward positions without receiving a single artillery round. The Russian infantry in the trench line, accustomed to fighting under the protective umbrella of constant artillery support, found themselves engaging Ukrainian assault troops with only small arms and a handful of RPGs. The fight was sharp, but brief. Ukrainian forces cleared 200 meters of trench line within 90 minutes. 8 Russian soldiers were killed. 11 surrendered. The remainder withdrew east. Simultaneously, a second assault group hit Russian positions 500 meters to the north. Same result: light resistance. No artillery response. Ukrainian FPV drone teams provided close support, dropping modified grenades on Russian soldiers attempting to regroup in a secondary trench line. 3 drones, 3 direct hits. The regrouping attempt collapsed. Over the next 5 days, Ukrainian forces consolidated positions along a 2-kilometer stretch of the Kreminna forest belt. The gains were modest by the standards of maneuver warfare, hundreds of meters, not kilometers. But in the context of the Kreminna front, where the line had barely moved in months, they were significant, and they were made possible entirely by the silence of Russian guns. The Russian command scrambled to restore ammunition flow. Emergency convoys were dispatched from secondary depots deeper inside Russia, reportedly from storage facilities near Rostov-on-Don and Voronezh. But rerouting the supply chain through alternative nodes was not a matter of simply sending trucks on different roads. It required new distribution plans, new loading schedules, new convoy routes that would need to be assessed for Ukrainian strike risk. The bureaucratic and logistical friction was enormous. Ukrainian intelligence monitored the recovery effort through continued satellite surveillance and partisan reporting. By March 25th, 11 days after the strike, ammunition deliveries to forward positions along the Kreminna axis had partially resumed, but at levels well below the pre-strike baseline. Some units were still operating at 50 to 60% of their normal allocation. Full recovery, Ukrainian analysts estimated, would take until early April at minimum. 3 weeks. That was the window. 3 weeks of degraded Russian artillery capability across one of the most active sectors of the entire front. What would NATO doctrine have recommended differently in this scenario? Would a broader simultaneous strike on secondary depots have been more effective? Or did Ukraine correctly prioritize the single highest value target? Drop your analysis in the comments. Now let's pull back and look at what the Starobilsk strike teaches us about the broader evolution of this war. The first lesson is about logistics vulnerability. The Russian military's decision to concentrate ammunition at a single hub near Starobilsk was not stupid. It was rational within a framework that prioritized logistical efficiency over survivability. Fewer hubs mean simpler distribution, fewer convoy routes, easier inventory management. In a conventional war against an opponent without deep strike capability, this approach works fine, but Ukraine has deep strike capability. ATACMS, Storm Shadow, and an increasingly sophisticated drone arsenal have given Ukraine the ability to reach targets 100 kilometers or more behind the front line. In this environment, logistics concentration becomes logistics vulnerability. The Starobilsk depot was a single point of failure, and it failed. Russian logistics planners knew this risk existed. They had already lost multiple ammunition depots to Ukrainian strikes dating back to the summer of 2022, when HIMARS first demonstrated its ability to hit rear area targets. But the organizational incentive to centralize was strong, and dispersed storage networks are expensive and manpower intensive to maintain. The Russian military chose efficiency over redundancy. Ukraine made them pay for that choice. The second lesson is about the integration of intelligence streams. The Starobilsk strike succeeded not because of any single intelligence source, but because of the fusion of multiple sources into a coherent targeting picture. Satellite imagery provided the physical layout. Partisan networks provided the operational pattern, the resupply schedule, the timing of the overnight loading window, the presence of Shahed components. Signals intelligence confirmed the depot's role in the broader logistics chain and identified the specific formations it served. No single source would have been sufficient. Satellite imagery alone could have identified the facility, but without ground-level reporting on the resupply timing, the strike might have hit an empty loading area. Partisan reports alone could have confirmed the depot's importance, but without satellite imagery, the precise aim points for the ATACMS warheads could not have been calculated. The intelligence fusion was the weapon. The ATACMS was just the delivery mechanism. The third lesson is about exploitation. The Starobilsk strike would have been significant, even if Ukraine had done nothing on the ground afterward. Destroying thousands of tons of ammunition and hundreds of millions of dollars of material is strategically impactful, regardless of what happens on the front line. But Ukraine amplified the impact by acting on the window of opportunity the strike created. This is harder than it sounds. Recognizing that the enemy's artillery has gone quiet is one thing. Launching offensive operations into that silence, operations that require infantry to advance across open ground toward prepared positions, requires confidence that the silence will last, and it requires assault forces that are trained, equipped, and ready to move on short notice. The 12th Azov Brigade's ability to launch coordinated attacks within 4 days of the strike suggests a level of operational planning that anticipated the window before it opened. That's the mark of a military that fights intelligently. Ukraine doesn't just react, it prepares. It models the second-order effects of its strikes and prepositions forces to exploit them. This is combined arms warfare at the operational level, not just tanks and infantry working together on the battlefield, but deep fires and ground maneuvers synchronized across time and space. Real tactics, real consequences. WarfistTV. The fourth lesson concerns the cost calculus. 2 ATACMS missiles, total value roughly $3 million, destroyed an estimated $380 to $520 million in Russian ammunition and equipment, degraded Russian combat capability across an entire army-level sector for 3 weeks, and enabled Ukrainian territorial gains that Russia had spent months and hundreds of lives trying to prevent. This is the fundamental math of precision deep strike. Every ATACMS missile that hits a high-value target delivers returns that dwarf its cost. Every ammunition depot destroyed forces Russia to spend weeks rebuilding what took months to accumulate. Every successful strike validates the Western decision to supply these weapons and strengthens the case for continued deliveries. Russia cannot win this cost exchange equation. They can disperse their ammunition. They can harden their storage. They can increase their air defense coverage. All of these measures cost money, time, and manpower, resources diverted from the front line. And even with these measures, the risk remains, because Ukraine is getting better at this. Better intelligence, better targeting, better timing. The fifth lesson is the most uncomfortable one for Russian military planners. It's about trust. When a battery commander in the 144th Division was rationed to 37 rounds per day, he wasn't just losing firepower. He was losing confidence in the system that was supposed to keep him fighting. Every Russian soldier on the Kreminna line who experienced the sudden silence of their own guns understood something fundamental. The rear area is not safe. The ammunition might not come. The next resupply convoy might burn before it reaches you. That erosion of trust is cumulative. It doesn't reset when the ammunition flow resumes. Every Russian officer who lived through the post-Starobilsk shortage carries that memory into the next battle. It changes behavior. It creates hesitation. It makes commanders hoard ammunition rather than expend it freely, which degrades their tactical effectiveness even when supplies are adequate. Ukraine is not just destroying Russian materiel, it is degrading Russian confidence. And confidence in war is a weapon as powerful as any missile. Now, the answer to our earlier question. How many tons of ammunition did Ukraine estimate were stored at the Starobilsk depot? The answer is B, 4,000 to 6,000 tons. Ukrainian military intelligence assessed the facility typically held between 4,000 and 6,000 tons of ordnance, based on the volume of rail deliveries, the number of storage bunkers identified in satellite imagery, and partisan reporting on the tempo of outbound truck convoys. The post-strike analysis estimated that between 3,500 and 5,000 tons were destroyed, essentially the full inventory at the time of the attack. For context, 4,000 tons of ammunition is roughly what the Russian military expends across the entire Donbass front in 5 to 7 days of heavy combat operations. The Starobilsk strike didn't just destroy a warehouse, it erased nearly a week's worth of firepower in a single night. So here are the questions worth considering. Was Ukraine right to strike during the resupply window, maximizing truck losses but accepting the risk that the window might shift? Or would a strike at a different time with less collateral but more certainty have been wiser? Could Russia have prevented this outcome by dispersing its ammunition storage earlier? And if so, Why didn't they? Was it organizational inertia, cost constraints, or a miscalculation of Ukrainian strike capability? And what would you have done differently? If you were the Ukrainian commander planning this operation, would you have committed both ATACMS missiles simultaneously, or held one in reserve to restrike after an initial bomb damage assessment? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is where tactical analysis becomes a conversation, not a lecture. Subscribe to WarfistTV, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The fields around Starobilsk are quiet now. The fires burned out days ago, but the craters remain. The scorched earth where thousands of tons of Russian ammunition once sat is visible from space, a dark scar on the landscape, still radiating faintly in thermal imagery. And somewhere on the Kreminna line, a Ukrainian soldier is advancing through a forest that used to be impassable, moving forward in silence, the silence Ukraine created. Modern warfare punishes logistics failures without mercy, and the wreckage at Starobilsk stands as proof that in this war, the side that strikes smarter will always outlast the side that simply stockpiles more. Stay vigilant.